So I think it's about time I introduce you to someone special. Internet, SCOBY, SCOBY, internet. I feel kind of short sitting on this chair. That's better. Hello, beautiful people of the internet. Welcome back, or if we have never met before, welcome to this little space. I got a comment a while ago, someone asking me to share my kombucha making routine. So in today's video, I'm gonna show you how I make kombucha. So you've already met SCOBY. This is my SCOBY hotel. We'll get into that later. SCOBY and I go way back. We actually don't go that far back. I got SCOBY last summer on the side of a road out of somebody's truck. And they were very nice. They were the sister of someone off of Facebook Marketplace where I found SCOBY for free. And since then, I have grown many SCOBYs. I've given many away to friends, to my mom, to my boyfriend, and I just spread the SCOBY love. I even had a SCOBY night, a kombucha night with my friends last summer. I think it was last summer. It might have been during the winter. I'm not completely sure. But since we've already talked about SCOBY, the first ingredient that we'll need, let's go over all the other ingredients and supplies that you will need for kombucha. Other than SCOBY, you are going to need some tea. Ideally, you would buy bulk to reduce plastic and waste and all the likes, but I'm a broke university student, so I just buy whatever is cheaper. Also, ideally, you'd probably buy organic because SCOBY can be a little bit sensitive because it is a bacteria, so any kind of chemicals it doesn't really love. But I haven't had a problem with just plain tea from the grocery store, whether it be green or black. I don't know what brand this is, let me go check. Club size, President's Choice, Orange Pico. Basically, you're gonna want either green or black tea because it has caffeine in it, and SCOBY feeds off of caffeine and sugar. Which brings us to the next ingredient, sugar. So when it comes to sugar, I'm sure you could experiment with sugar, but I like to stick to plain sugar. You can just get this Rogers, like literally white sugar, from the grocery store. And I've also used this organic cane sugar that I got from Costco. Now, before we get any further, I want to loop back quickly because I just said that SCOBY likes eating caffeine and sugar. SCOBY stands for a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. Basically, what these floaty little SCOBYs are these colonies of bacteria and yeast that work together to eat the sugars and eat the caffeine in the sweet tea that we're gonna make, and they turn sweet tea into kombucha. Let's see if we can get a closer look. All the stringy stuff is yeast. All the stuff sitting at the bottom, I'm pretty sure is dead yeast. And then these floaty white bits, that is the bacteria mainly. The yeast is like the brown, floaty, stringy, or cloudy stuff at the bottom. But we've got SCOBY, tea, sugar, and all we need now is water. Water. So like I mentioned earlier, SCOBY can be a little bit sensitive to any kind of chemicals, anything processed. So the kind of water that I use to make my sweet tea, to make my kombucha, is filtered water that I get from really any grocery store. This whole thing cost me $3 Canadian to fill up. If I had a Brita filter, or if I had a fridge water filter, or any kind of other in-home water filter, I'd probably just use water out of that. But I don't. All I have is tap water, and I don't trust the tap water with my precious little SCOBY. So I just fill this up every so often, just to be safe. Okay, and I think those are all the ingredients that we need. Sugar, tea, water, and our SCOBY. So let's do step one of making kombucha, which is making the sweet tea. Okay, so we have relocated to the stove and the countertop because it's time to pour our water for our sweet tea. So let me tell you the recipe, or the ratios I guess, that I'm gonna use today to make my sweet tea for my kombucha. So I'm grabbing this ratio out of the Kombucha Bible. It's called The Big Book of Kombucha. I'm just gonna kneel because I'm a little tired of standing. But I would recommend for all of your kombucha questions, you can find a lot of things online now, but I feel like when it comes to fermentation and something such as kombucha, it's kind of nice to know that you're getting it from a reliable source. And this one shows pictures of all sorts of stuff, like if you don't know. If your kombucha's happy, they have pictures of a bunch of happy SCOBYs. If you don't know what temperature to brew your kombucha in, it has a whole page about all the temperatures and how slow or fast or what kind of bacteria or flavor certain temperatures will favor. They've got a bunch of recipes, a bunch of ways to use kombucha, a bunch of ways to use old SCOBYs, which is cool. And the page that I've sent most often to my friends and family when they're scared of their SCOBYs looking a little bit weird, because sometimes SCOBYs can look weird, is a picture of all the molds on the SCOBYs. And on the topic of mold, don't take my word for it because I'm not a professional or anything, but I would say most of the time, if it's not fuzzy and if it's not a super bright color, then it's probably not mold. It's probably just the yeast. Like if it's a white color and it's smooth, or if it's brown, it's probably fine. But really, when in doubt, throw it out and just start over. Anyhows, back to the recipe. So in here it calls for 1 gallon of cool chlorine-free water, which we got in my water bottle, 4 to 6 tea bags, or 1 to 2 tablespoons of loose leaf tea, 1 cup of sugar, 1 full-sized SCOBY, and 1 to 2 cups of mature kombucha for starter liquid. Now let me tell you what most people probably do, and then I'll show you what I do because I'm lazy and I'm impatient, and you can choose which version or which method you want to use for yourself. Now for both of these, I will be using the example of a gallon because that is the container size that I have, our gallon jars. So you just need to adjust this depending on what kind of jar you have to suit your needs. But what most people would probably do if they had a gallon jar would be to fill up their jar like 3/4 of the way with water, take that water, heat it all up, put their tea bags in it, put their sugar in it, steep their tea, take the tea bags out, and then let the whole batch of tea sit to rest until it gets to a comfortable temperature for the SCOBY, which is room temperature. Or honestly, anything under like 35 degrees Celsius. However, your girl is impatient and I don't want to wait however long it takes for boiling hot sweet tea to cool down before I can put my SCOBY in it. So what do? I grab a little bit of water, enough to fully dissolve my sugar and to steep my tea, make a really strong concentrate, and then I just top it off with room temperature water, and then I don't have to wait for it to cool down. Now, something that you're gonna be seeing me do today is making a double batch of this because not only am I going to be making sweet tea for the kombucha that I'm gonna end up drinking, but I'm also gonna make some sweet tea to be able to fill up my SCOBY hotels, which is what I showed you earlier that house all of my SCOBYs because I need to keep these guys alive somehow, and the way to keep them alive is by feeding them sweet tea. So I'm gonna go ahead and pour myself 6 cups of unchlorinated water, not because that number is important, but just so that I know when the tea is done brewing how much I need to split it up half and half to be able to dilute it. Now, since I'm making 2 batches, we're going to need 2 cups of sugar. If you were only doing 1 gallon, you'd only use 1 cup of sugar. But remember, since I'm doubling it, I'm doing 2 cups of sugar. And then for tea bags, since you would usually use between 4 and 6 tea bags per batch, a batch being a gallon, I'm gonna do 10. And usually it kind of depends on my mood, how many black and how many green I put in. You can do all green, you can do all black. I just like a mix. So I'm gonna do 5 black and 5 green. Now I think the right way to do this is actually to bring your water to a boil before you add everything in, but sometimes when I'm lazy I just do this. And the reason it's probably a good idea to bring your water to a boil before adding everything in is to kill off any other little bacterias and stuff that might be in your water that could disturb your SCOBY and your kombucha, but since I literally just got mine out of a bottled water, I think I'm pretty safe. But if you want to be extra cautious, boil all of your water and then add in your sugar and your tea bags. Now all I'm gonna do is wait for my water to heat up enough for the sugar to dissolve, and until I feel like it's probably a strong enough sweet tea. And once that happens, I will be back. Okay, don't mind if it just got super dark in here. Well, not super dark, but darker than normal, because it just started madly pouring outside. Okay, so it's been a little bit. I think my sweet tea is done, so I'm gonna take the tea bags out. If you don't like bitterness, I would suggest you don't squeeze them. Now, if you remember earlier, I put 6 cups of water in total to make my sweet tea. So I'm gonna take half of that out, so 3 cups of sweet tea, and I'm gonna put them into my brewing vessel. This one I actually found at the thrift store, and it has this little temperature reader, which is pretty cool. Because then I can tell if my SCOBY is too warm, too hot when it's brewing, and when I put the water in, I can see if it is cold enough for my SCOBY. Anyhow, I'm gonna measure out 3 cups of this and put it into this. But I'm gonna do it over the sink because sweet tea is sticky and I don't trust my skills. 2 cups. And 1 more cup. 1 cup. And now I'm just gonna top this guy off with my filtered water. I'll give it a little stir with my yeasty spoon. And just like that, the temperature is down to 26 degrees Celsius, which is 79 degrees Fahrenheit, or maybe it's 28. Either way, it's safe to put in my SCOBY and my starter tea. So here are a couple of SCOBYs that I took out of my SCOBY hotel. I made sure to grab one that have yeast on them and they look pretty new. The older SCOBYs get, the darker they are. So this guy on the top is pretty light, but I'm just gonna leave him in there. And then here is a cup of starter liquid, which is basically a fancy way of saying kombucha that's already been brewed. I grabbed it out of my SCOBY hotel, but in the second part of this video, you'll see that you can also take it from your batch that has already been brewed. Basically, the reason that you're adding some kombucha liquid into your sweet tea mixture is that this will lower the pH, it'll make it more acidic, and it'll make it less likely for mold and whatever else is floating around the air to land on your SCOBY and grow. Because SCOBY likes acidity and mold and stuff, not so much. So if SCOBY is strong and mold is unhappy, it's less likely that any pathogenic stuff is gonna grow on your kombucha. So let's add that in, shall we? Got our starter tea. And I'll tell you this later, but when it comes to starter tea, you always wanna make sure that you're grabbing reserves from the top of whatever vessel you're grabbing it from. So whether it be an already brewed batch or from your SCOBY hotel, grab it from the top. I'll explain why later. Now I'll put the SCOBYs in. Just like that. And I just like to cover mine with a coffee filter. So I don't think I've explained this yet, but when you're making kombucha, there are basically 2 steps that you go through. One is the first fermentation, which is the part that we did up until now, which basically is just turning the sweet tea into kombucha. And the second fermentation is the next part that we're gonna go into, which is basically the part where you will flavor and make your kombucha all fizzy. But in the first fermentation, you want your SCOBY to be able to breathe because this part of the fermentation is aerobic, meaning it needs oxygen. So just cover it with something that it can breathe in. It could be anything really. It could be a cloth, it could be a coffee filter like this. You just wanna make sure that no bugs can get in and that it is sanitized so that no weird stuff is dropping onto your SCOBY. But I think that's all I have to show you for the first fermentation. So I'm gonna go pretend to put this on a shelf. I'm gonna pretend to wait 7 to 21 days, and then I will be back with a completed brew of kombucha, and I'll show you how to do the second fermentation, basically how to make it flavorful and fizzy if you do so wish. But I'll see you in 7 to 21 days. Now, okay, imagine that 7 to 21 or so days have passed since you put your sweet tea in with your starter liquid in with your SCOBY, and your kombucha is now at a flavor that you like, and you've decided that the first fermentation is over. I'm gonna show you how to bottle your kombucha. Oh, let's just go down here then. I'm gonna show you how to bottle your kombucha if you like it fizzy. So the second fermentation is the phase where if you like your kombucha flavored, this is when you can flavor it. So basically what you're gonna need are some flip top bottles. So the only thing I'll say about the bottles is you don't wanna go and buy flip top bottles from the dollar store because usually those ones are decorative and they're not actually meant to withstand the pressure of carbonation and fermentation, which means that they might actually end up exploding on you, which you don't want, especially if you're flavoring your kombucha and have staining berries in them or something crazy of the sort. So what I did is I basically went to a bottle depot and I asked if I could buy some bottles off of them. These are just old Grolsch bottles, and I mean, if you drink beer or any other kind of carbonated drinks, you could just reuse the bottles that you're already getting because of those. I've also heard people use kombucha bottles that they bought from the store, but really the flip top ones are, I find, the best just because they have the best seal. But you can get them in numerous different sizes. There's these little guys, there's this mid-sized one that my grandpa gave me, and there's a massive Grolsch bottle that my grandpa gave me. And I'm sure if you want, you could go out and order on Amazon fermenting bottles or beer making bottles or ones that are actually made to hold up to carbonation. But it's probably just a whole lot cheaper to go to the bottle depot and buy some off of them if you don't mind just giving them a little clean. Anyhow, let's get into the bottling. Now, when it comes to bottling your kombucha, here's the first thing that you're probably gonna wanna do unless you have a SCOBY hotel with a lot of reserves. You're gonna wanna take your kombucha, take out whatever SCOBYs you need. This one's got a lot of SCOBYs, I'm not sure why. And you're also gonna wanna keep 1 to 2 cups of this batch to use as a starter in your next batch. So now we have our SCOBYs for our next batch, and we have our starter tea for our next batch. And I can't quite remember if I've mentioned this already, but when you're saving some of your kombucha to use as a starter for your next batch, you always wanna take it from the top of your brew or pour it in, and you don't want to just take the leftovers from the bottom, because usually the bottom is where all the yeast sits, and there's 2 problems with that. A, because you want to keep the yeast for the carbonation, because the yeast is actually what makes the bubbles, and B, if you keep on using all of the yeasty stuff at the bottom as your starter liquid, you're just going to keep on getting yeastier and yeastier kombucha, and it's probably going to end up tasting really funny. So just as a rule of thumb, always take off a couple of cups of starter liquid from the top of your brew before bottling it, if you even want to bottle it at all. But okay, with that being said, once you take your couple of cups of starter liquid off of this batch, you want to give everything a little mix before bottling it, because we want all the little bottles to have the same amount of yeast, because if not, you're gonna get some bottles that are super fizzy and some that are really not as fizzy. So give everything a good little mix. Get all the yeast on my spoon. And now that everything is mixed, you just pour it into your bottles. And ideally, you would fill up your bottles so that there's still an inch of headroom left, because that is going to be kind of the sweet spot between your kombucha still being able to pressure up and carbonate, but there's still enough air to compress so that your kombucha bottles don't blow up. Now, if you wanted to add flavor, this would also be the step once everything is poured to add in your flavor. There are so many kombucha recipe flavors online. I've done ginger before. A favorite of mine is buying those frozen berries and blending them and then adding them in as a puree kind of. And then when I go to pour myself the kombucha, I'll just filter out the little berry bits or the little like fruit SCOBY that it creates on top. I've also heard of people doing fruit juices. That works too. And my boyfriend really used to like making like an apple cinnamon kombucha, and I think he's also done orange and he liked that. So the possibilities are really endless, but I've been lazy lately, so I've just been keeping my kombucha flavors plain, but I still do like a little bit of fizz, so I have been doing a second carbonation. Now, what you're gonna wanna do after everything is poured and once you've added in your flavors is you're basically gonna close these up and leave them at room temperature for a couple of days and just give them a little burp every morning and every night. And what I mean by burp is you're literally just gonna pop the lid off like this until some of the air goes out. It'll probably pop a little bit. You'll hear it pff, go out. And basically all that's doing is releasing some of the pressure so that your bottles don't blow up. Now, if you're noticing that your kombucha during the second fermentation isn't burping, every time you go to burp it, there's no pressure kind of building up, you don't have to burp them every day. Like if you live somewhere that's colder, if you're fermenting in the winter, if maybe you just don't have a very yeasty batch or it's not getting very carbonated, if you know your bottles aren't gonna explode, you don't have to burp them. And then after a couple of days, once you feel like your kombucha is fizzy enough to your liking, you're basically gonna wanna pop them in the fridge and cool them down, because when liquid cools, it's able to hold in the carbonation better than when it's hot. So your kombucha in the fridge is going to keep all the carbonation that you've been jacking it up with for the past couple of days. Plus, putting it in the fridge will slow down the fermentation process. So basically, whatever flavor you taste in the bottles, once you put them in the fridge, it'll stay that flavor for a little while anyways. Now you might be wondering, Gabby, what are you gonna do with the rest of that sweet tea that you brewed earlier that you didn't put into your kombucha or your brewing batch of kombucha? Basically, I'm gonna use that for my SCOBY hotels, which is what I call, or what all kombucha makers call, the jar that they keep their extra SCOBYs in. Basically, just in case one of your batches go bad, maybe a SCOBY goes moldy, maybe a SCOBY just gets old, you basically have this container that has super, super strong liquid to keep all of your SCOBY safe. You have a bunch of SCOBYs and it just keeps growing new SCOBYs. So this is a SCOBY hotel, but it could also be like a SCOBY farm. Plus it also makes a really great starter liquid that is really strong, and usually I just use the starter liquid from my SCOBY hotels for my next batch rather than taking out of my brewed batch, just because it is so strong and I always need room to feed it with some sweet tea. I don't really have a set routine on how often I feed my SCOBYs. Maybe every other time I make kombucha, so every second week or so. You could leave it longer, you could probably do it more often. Just as long as you feel like your SCOBYs have enough food, enough caffeine and sugar to stay alive and happy, then that's probably feeding them enough. And just like my brew jar, the jar of kombucha that I'm actually making to drink, I just cover this guy with a coffee filter and a little rubber band to keep all of the bugs out. And I would show you me pouring in the sweet tea, but I'm just gonna wait for it to cool down because I don't mind just leaving it there and pouring it in whenever is convenient. So I'm gonna go put him back in his little nook. And I forgot to mention something crucial to the kombucha brewing experience. You always have to tell your SCOBYs that you love them and send them good vibes. Love you. Good vibes. That's it. It's not too crazy. Oh yeah, and I guess like you just saw, when it comes to storing your kombucha, whether it be the hotel or for brewing, I like to keep mine in a warm, draft-free place that is out of direct sunlight. Okay, my friends, so I know that's probably a lot to take in. You might be feeling overwhelmed, so let's go over a quick recap, a quick step-by-step if you yourself are wanting to try making kombucha. I will also leave all of this in the description, and always feel free to ask me questions if you have any questions, and I will get back to you as quickly as possible. So for the first fermentation, the steps are basically making your sweet tea, letting the sweet tea cool down enough that it won't kill your SCOBY, and then adding in the SCOBY and the starter tea, covering your sweet tea plus the starter tea plus SCOBY up with either a coffee filter or a cloth, basically anything to keep the bugs out that is clean and that will let SCOBY breathe, and you're just gonna let it sit there for 7 to 21-ish days depending on the humidity or the heat in your house. And you're gonna wanna store that SCOBY in a warm, draft-free, and out of direct sunlight place. Common mistakes of the first fermentation that I have run into is A, using water that is not filtered. It'll weaken your SCOBY, not a good idea. Make sure you're using clean water. B, make sure that your sweet tea is cooled off enough before you add in your kombucha and your starter tea. Otherwise, you might kill your SCOBY and weird moldy things will grow and it's just not a good idea. C, make sure that the starter tea that you're adding in on the first fermentation is from the top of a brew and not from the bottom, or else you'll get all the yeasty stuff and the flavor might start tasting weird. And I think that's it, but if I forget anything, I will add it in when I'm editing this video. Now let's go over the steps of the second fermentation. For the second fermentation, basically all you're doing is taking the SCOBYs out of their container. If you don't have a SCOBY hotel and you need some starter liquid, also reserving a cup of the starter liquid or however much you need from the top of that batch. Then giving it a mix and divvying it up in your bottles. And then if you want to add flavor, you can add it in now. You're gonna close up the bottles, let them sit in a warm place, out of direct sunlight though, for a couple of days or until you like the level of fizziness. And then you're just gonna throw them in your fridge. And while they're sitting there, with the lids on, make sure to burp them twice a day, and only burp them less if you honestly feel like there isn't enough carbonation to make a little puff. Then you can keep the lids on longer if it's not getting very fizzy. And honestly, I don't really think there are many mistakes that people make in the second fermentation, other than forgetting to mix the kombucha before divvying it up into your bottles. Because yeah, that stage is basically just taking out what you need for your next batch, giving it a mix, and splitting it up into the bottles. Again, if I forgot anything, I will add it in now while I'm editing. But alas, my lovely friends, I think that's it. I think that's everything that I have to tell you about kombucha. I will leave in the description a link for the book that has really helped me, that I call my Kombucha Bible, if you're interested in that. Like I mentioned before, if you have any questions about kombucha, leave them for me in the comments and I will try my best to answer them as well as I can. But I hope this video was helpful, and I hope maybe it inspires you to try a kombucha journey of your own. If you don't have a SCOBY, ask around for some friends, check out Facebook Marketplace or Kijiji, that's where I found mine. I know a lot of like health food stores and stuff have them too. Or you could even try buying a raw, unflavored, unpasteurized kombucha from the store and try growing your own SCOBY. Really, there are so many options and they all probably work. I don't know how well the dried out SCOBYs work. I would imagine it's best to get one fresh from a friend or from someone who has a really healthy kombucha colony, but basically just get whatever you can get your hands on and I'm sure you will figure it out from there. Anyhow, here are a couple of videos the YouTube algorithm thinks you might enjoy. Thank you as always for spending this little chunk of your day with me here in our little corner of the internet. I hope this video finds you well. I hope you're taking care of yourself and I will see you in the next one.